Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Former US President Joe Biden calls out the Trump administration for their handling and dismantling of the country's social security system. China's economy unexpectedly grows, but experts say it is too soon to call as the Trump tariffs kick in. Israel's defense secretary bans humanitarian aid from entering Gaza in order to exert pressure on Hamas. And a landmark ruling finally defines what a woman is, as the UK Supreme Court says it all comes down to biological sex. To our top story, and former US President Joe Biden has attacked current President Donald Trump during a conference in Chicago. In his first speech since leaving office, the former president accused the Trump administration of taking a hatchet to social security system. Trump and Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency have been on a cost-cutting mission, laying off staff at the agency, which pays out $1.6 trillion in benefits every year. Although Biden did not refer to Trump by name, he didn't hold back when it came to calling out what he described as the damage and destruction he has caused. Take a listen.
Why are these guys taking name and Social Security now? Well, they're following that old line from tech startups. The quote is, move fast, break things. Well, they're certainly breaking things. They're shooting first and aiming later. And as a result, the result is a lot of needless pain and sleepless nights. They want to wreck it so they can rob it. They want to wreck it so they can rob it. Why do they want to rob it? In order to deliver huge tax cuts to billionaires and big corporations and keep it going. They want to make permanent the 2017 tax cuts, which overwhelmingly benefited the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations. Fewer than 100 days, this new administration has made done so much damage and so much destruction. It's kind of breathtaking it could happen that soon.
We are now joined by Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Professor Lucas, thank you for joining me. So, Joe Biden is back. During his speech, he said, "We are facing a threat from some Republican members to cut and gut Social Security." Do you agree with his criticism of the Trump administration?
Well, as always, I think it's important to get beyond personalities and to get to the facts. And the facts are that the budget resolutions that have been adopted by Republicans in the House and in the Senate, they've yet to be reconciled in a final bill. But the proposals raise the retirement age for Social Security gradually to 69. And that's an effective decrease in about 13% in Social Security benefits. But I think far more important than that is the actual damaging of the Social Security Administration by, that metaphorical chainsaw that has been wielded by Elon Musk and the department, which is not a department, just a group of advisors called Government Efficiency. Far from ensuring efficiency, an already overstretched Social Security staff has had thousands of people who have either been fired or pushed into resignations. You've had cuts in some departments of more than 50%, in others of more than 25%. That is increasing the wait times to deal with Social Security issues, including applications, including payments. It is causing unnecessary stress on many, many Americans. And this is on top of the fact that the Social Security Administration itself has been compromised by the effective theft of its documents by Elon Musk people. If you were to add to that, and we can discuss this, the extensive cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and to food assistance programs, yes, I think it's fair to say, without reference to Joe Biden, just on the basis of the facts, that the Trump administration is ripping out great holes in the social welfare net.
The lines in this speech from Biden, I thought, were a real blast from the past. A lot of them I heard on the campaign trail. Should the Democrats stop sticking to the script if they want to be an opposition force in the US right now?
Well, I think the issue with respect is beyond electoral politics. I think it's beyond Democrat versus Republican. I think it's not just simply Democrats. I think it's independents. I think it's members of other parties, and yes, indeed, Republicans, who should be raising these issues that you and I are discussing. Donald Trump won, I think, in large part because of Americans' concerns over the economy, over their economic futures. And the reality here is that these effective cuts to Social Security, the cuts of almost $900 billion that are proposed for Medicare and Medicaid over the next decade, and the cuts of $230 billion for food assistance will mean many Americans are worse off. So Trump, who could benefit from those concerns while in opposition, I think once you are the president and administration, you have to carry responsibility for this. So whether or not the Democrats benefit, from this, that's not my immediate concern. It's how many Americans lose out because of the damage that's being done to Social Security and to other programs.
Biden only referred to the Republican president only as this guy during his speech. He never ever mentioned Trump's name. Does this highlight the deepening divide between Republicans and Democrats, especially on domestic issues, as you were just saying? Or do you think this is a far more personal attack?
Well, Biden has got personal grievance against Donald Trump, I think, with justification. But again, I think, you kind of put this to the side. In a way, not naming Trump, just referring him to this guy, pushing him off to the side, it allows us to get back to the fundamental issue that this isn't just a Donald Trump question. I mean, this is a question of the advisors around Trump. It is a question, yes, of Elon Musk, who has no official government position, who has no authority to be ripping apart Social Security. And it brings into the question those Republicans in the House and in the Senate who are not standing up against this. In fact, they're enabling this. So I think the more that we get away from personalities on this and the more that we get to the actual issues that are involved, that's going to be an important thing, because let's be honest here, Joe Biden is yesterday's politician. He's gone. He's not going to be a force in U.S. politics in the future. And for the future of all Americans, you've got to get to responsible people, both Republicans and Democrats, who are going to make a difference.
Professor, if we just have a look forward, and we've spoken about the domestic issues, Social Security, the cuts that have been made by Doge and by Elon Musk, what do you think the midterms are possibly going to look like for the Republicans and for Donald Trump? And we haven't forgotten that the tariffs are also looming in the background.
Well, I think by the time you get to November 2026 in the midterms, I think if you have the economic downturns caused not just simply by the likely rise in inflation, including the effects of tariffs, but if you have the economic and social effects that government no longer works properly, that doesn't bode well for the Republicans. And indeed, Donald Trump has slipped significantly in opinion polls in the less than 3 months that he's been in office. But I have to take this beyond the question of the midterms in November 2026. Before we get there, America's in the unprecedented situation where you have what is now an authoritarian government. If you take the damage to the agencies, if you take the illegal and unconstitutional measures effectively disappearing people, as they have done recently, sending them to mass prisons in El Salvador, if you talk about the denial of judicial rights to Americans, if you talk about Donald Trump, as he did yesterday, denying the legitimacy of the Supreme Court when it made a unanimous decision in a case involving one of those disappeared immigrants, you have a question of an emergency regarding authoritarian government that is here now, not in November 2026. So we've got to talk about that even before we get to the midterms.
Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin, thank you very much for your insights. We have a lot more to talk about on this, of course. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
China's economy has performed better than expected in the first quarter of this year. However, it's too early to know how it will be affected by President Trump's 145% tariffs. Economists predicted China's GDP would grow by about 5.1% from January to March compared to 2024, but it actually grew 5.4%. It's believed the growth is down to exports delivering in bulk before the tariffs do come into play this month. We are now joined by our correspondent, Patrick Falk, who is in Hong Kong. Patrick, thank you so much for joining me. OK, China's first quarter GDP growth did beat forecasts. We know this is backward-looking data, but what does this tell us about the state of the economy as this trade war appears to be deepening?
Well, look, the front-loading of shipments certainly would have made some difference. It's unclear to what extent it made a difference, but I think another more encouraging number for China was retail sales. Retail sales were up by 5.9% in the January to March period, year on year. And consumer demand has really been one area of the economy where China has persistently struggled. So this was perhaps a sign that the economic recovery was back on track. And this is also one of the things that's been very frustrating for Beijing, this feeling that what's happening in this trade fight is designed to some extent to undermine China's economic recovery. That's not to say that it isn't still grappling with lots of very difficult and challenging problems, including weak employment, deflationary pressures, and an ongoing property market slump as well. But the fact of the matter is, it is going to be much more challenging for the Chinese economy now with this trade war in motion. We've seen downgrades in growth forecasts from many different banks over the past 2 weeks or so. UBS in particular painted a very gloomy picture, downgrading growth for China this year to 3.4% from 4% previously. So, a lot of what will happen in the long run will depend on what sort of stimulus the Chinese government unleashes in the coming days and weeks and months ahead. But certainly it does seem as though it's going to be very challenging indeed.
The US is urging China to come to the negotiating table, but so far Beijing is really resisting doing this. What more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, that's right. Donald Trump has said that, China needs to come to the table and make a deal. The White House has reiterated that the ball is in Beijing's court. But as we've said before, the conditions aren't being set for something like that to happen. China has now said that it wants to talk, but that it wants the Trump administration to cut out the disparaging remarks and to handle this with respect. And that it also wants a more consistent stance from the Americans before it engages in any way. The other thing that we're hearing as well, Beijing also wants the US to appoint a point person for these discussions. China has already done that. That's so that essentially if Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping were to meet with one another, then they would just get on it and sign any sort of deal that they come about with. And, the problem for China in particular is they don't want to have to meet with the US and not to sort of get any positive outcome. So this all has to be done in a particular way as far as China's concerned. You might say that China has now set conditions for these talks and that the ball is actually now in Washington's court.
So the Chinese leader Xi Jinping is currently on a tour of Southeast Asia. What does he hope to achieve from this whirlwind trip we've seen him be on?
Yeah, look, it's an important trip coming at a sensitive time. And, no doubt Beijing will want support from these countries, Malaysia, Vietnam and Cambodia, in trying to push back and coordinate efforts against the US. It will be difficult, though. They are all playing a balancing act. And if you take Malaysia, for instance, Malaysia exported 44 billion worth of goods to the US last year versus $41 billion to China. So they are very similar in terms of trade profiles for Malaysia. So as I say, it's a balancing act for them. They will not want to do anything that is going to upset the US, particularly at a time when they are trying to negotiate deals themselves. They will want to, deepen ties with Beijing at the same time, something Malaysia certainly has done since Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has come to office. But, they're unlikely to heed to any calls to resist concessions or anything like that. But, this perhaps shouldn't be looked in the context of coming up with some sort of trade negotiation between China and these Southeast Asian nations. But it's more really about long-term diplomacy. And President Xi will want to go there and convince them that China is a more stable, long-term partner for these countries. And perhaps he will have some success doing that. He is also signing various deals with Vietnam and Malaysia and Cambodia. And certainly you can see that they are warming to Beijing in many ways. And they feel that what's happening with the US is very unfair as well.
Patrick Falk in Hong Kong, always great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and peace envoy Steve Witkoff are in Paris today to discuss the future of Ukraine with European allies. The talks are expected to last until Friday. Their trip comes as Ukraine votes to extend martial law until the 6th of August. 3 US senators will visit Taiwan this week to discuss trade as Taipei continues tariff talks with Washington. Taiwan was due to be hit with a 32% levy as part of President Trump's now paused regime. The US is Taiwan's most international backer and arms supplier, despite a lack of formal diplomatic ties. The number of people using disposable e-cigarettes or vapes has fallen in the UK ahead of a countrywide ban that comes into force on the 1st of June. The percentage of people aged 16 to 24 who mainly use disposable vapes has dropped by nearly half in the last year. Researchers believe vape users are now switching to refillable and also rechargeable vapes as the new law does come into play. And members of the World Health Organization have reached a legal agreement of how to learn from COVID-19 and prepare the world for future pandemics. The deal aims to ensure fair access to drugs and vaccines across the globe between wealthy and poorer countries. It comes as the WHO is impacted financially as part of cuts in US foreign funding. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has said no humanitarian aid will enter Gaza in order to put pressure on Hamas. Negotiations for a ceasefire are ongoing, with Israeli officials repeating a need for military action to secure the release of hostages held by Hamas. Earlier today, 11 people, including women and children, were killed in Gaza City. We can now go live to Tel Aviv to speak to our correspondent, Trent Murray. Trent, thank you for joining me. The medical charity MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, says Gaza has become a mass grave, highlighting the prevention of humanitarian aid to the region. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, that's right, Leigh Ann. It is a scathing critique, isn't it, from Doctors Without Borders, the latest NGO to really add their voice to this chorus of condemnation from NGOs about the situation on the ground. Doctors Without Borders, the French NGO, putting out a fairly lengthy statement. I'll read some of it to you. They say that they are witnessing in real time the destruction and forced displacement of an entire population within Gaza. They are particularly critical of that March 23rd incident, which of course we've consistently reported on, where 15 paramedics were killed by Israeli forces. The IDF has confirmed that they were behind that operation in which those 15 medics were killed. In this statement, they say that this horrific killing of aid workers is yet another example of the complete disregard shown by Israeli forces for the protection of humanitarian and medical workers. It's interesting too, being a French NGO, this statement comes 24 hours after we know a telephone call was held between French President Emmanuel Macron and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Macron himself, according to that statement from the Elysee Palace, told Prime Minister Netanyahu that the suffering in Gaza just needs to come to an end, that the civilian population continues to find itself in the firing line, and he has stressed from the French perspective that a ceasefire is the only way not just to end the suffering but also to get those Israeli hostages home.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has visited northern Gaza. What was the purpose of his trip there?
Yeah, and it's only been one of a handful of visits that we've seen the Prime Minister make to the Gaza Strip since this war began. He, of course, went with his Defence Minister, Israel Katz. He met with troops there, assessed the situation on the ground. He, of course, was with a very large media pack from the Israeli press pool in which he stressed that this war is about fighting for Israel's very existence and its future. He also had some pretty harsh words to say for Iran's Ayatollah, pointing to an online post that the Ayatollah made calling for Israel's complete destruction. He referenced the fact that those types of messages are being sent right at a time when the Americans are meant to be sitting down with Tehran to try and strike some sort of nuclear deal in order to try and calm tensions in the region. But again, he pointed to that post saying that they are clearly saying something very, very different when it comes to the state of Israel.
Trent has said there'll be no ceasefire if there is no Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. But how unrealistic is this proposal from Hamas?
Well, look, that statement, I think, in many ways gives an insight into just why these ceasefire negotiations are so difficult, because both sides here have got quite firm red lines. From Hamas's perspective, it is the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. But we are seeing yet again today that the red line from the Israelis' perspective is that they are not going to leave what they describe as the buffer zones. They say that they want to maintain those in order to make sure that Hamas cannot rearm itself and pose a threat to the state. Israel Katz's comments today, the defence minister, that there would be no withdrawal at all, not just from Gaza, it should be said, but also Lebanon and Syria, I think will complicate these negotiations even further, which is why, despite some optimism earlier in the week, particularly from the Egyptian mediators, that a deal may have been close, we are just not seeing any sort of breakthrough. Both sides really digging in on those red lines and making a ceasefire, it would appear, difficult to achieve.
Trent Murray in Tel Aviv, thank you for joining me. Let's take another look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Harvard University has responded to President Trump over its federal funding. The White House had given directions on how the university should be governed, hire and tech freezing over $2 billion in financial support. The university's president has said no government should be able to dictate what private universities can teach. Peru's former president Ollanta Humala has been found guilty of money laundering and has been sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Lima court concluded he accepted illegal funds from the former Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez, as well as a Brazilian construction company. Humala's lawyer said he would appeal against his client's conviction. Now, far-right UK political activist Tommy Robinson has lost an appeal challenge today over his prison sentence for contempt of court. Robinson was jailed in October after breaching a court order that banned him from spreading false allegations about a Syrian refugee who had sued him for libel. Despite lawyers arguing a decline in mental health, the Attorney General's office said his sentence reflected how gravely the court considered considers contempt. And a pair of climbers have broken the speed record for ascending the mountains of the Swiss Alps. Switzerland's Nicholas Hojak and Austria's Philipp Brugger beat the previous record by 10 hours, which was set more than 20 years ago. Now, the Texas Health Department reported there had been 561 cases of measles in the state on Tuesday. That's an increase of 20 from earlier this month. It comes as the U.S. government says it's sending 7 people to the Lone Star State to help battle the outbreak. Here's how Texans have been reacting.
It's really important to me to protect him. It's been a little bit nerve-wracking the last few months because he couldn't get the shot yet. I had been the MMR vaccine yet. I'd been checking with his pediatrician often to see if the ruling had changed. But now he can, and so I tried to get in here as quick as I could to give him some protection because it's scary. I mean, 2 children have died, you know, so I don't want that to be mine.
Well, I feel more confident that I couldn't get whatever this disease is, because if I would, it would probably hurt me very bad because of my diabetes.
I say to each his own. I don't think we should be mandated to get any kind of vaccine if we don't want to. But with my kids being, you know, immune compromised, and obviously they're not babies, so I didn't do it when they were small. I just had a really hard time giving that many immunizations to my babies, but now that they're older, I feel like we're better off and more equipped.
I didn't expect this to be in my own backyard. I knew there was unvaccinated or vulnerable populations in this area, but seeing an outbreak that's this big, that's probably now the largest outbreak Texas has seen in 30 years. This will probably be the largest outbreak that the U.S. has seen, probably in the same amount of time. And as we have more and more cases of measles, we're going to have a higher likelihood of seeing, just statistically, we're going to see more individuals needing to be hospitalized. And unfortunately, you know, we are going to, you know, possibly see more deaths. You know, we have amazing technology and resources in our medical system, but they can't always save.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. British inflation has slowed to its weakest in 3 months in March, and other measures watched by the Bank of England have also cooled. But higher bills and employer costs will put pressure on prices soon, as well as President Donald Trump's trade war. Inflation fell to 2.6% in March from 2.8% in February, below expectations. Now, Nvidia says it will be hit with $5.5 billion in costs after the U.S. government tightened export rules to China. The computer chip giant, which helped drive the artificial intelligence boom, will require licenses to export its most popular H20 chip to China. The rules come amid an escalating trade war between the U.S. and China. Turning to the sports news now, and British number 4 Harriet Dart has apologised for asking the umpire to tell her French opponent to put deodorant on. Dart made the comments during her first round match against Lois Bolson at the Rowan Open, which she lost in straight sets. And 5-time European champions Barcelona have reached their first Champions League semi-final in 6 seasons. They won a 5-3 aggregate despite being beaten 3-1 by Borussia Dortmund. Barcelona will play either Inter Milan or Bayern Munich in the last 4. The word woman is based on a person's biological sex. That is the decision of a UK Supreme Court judge in a significant ruling today. Lord Hodge said the conception of sex is binary and warned that the landmark decision should not be seen as a victory for one side over another. The UK government has said the ruling brings clarity and confidence for women. We can now speak to Edinburgh-based journalist Kat Stewart, who has been following this story. Kat, thank you for joining us. A pleasure to have you on. You've written an article on this topic today. This issue has been deliberated for quite some time and involves two very, very opposing viewpoints. Can you explain how it all came about in the first place?
This is a long-running and highly contentious issue, and it seems like a very straightforward question. Is man and woman about gender identity, or is it about biological sex? But in 2018, the Scottish Parliament passed legislation that was designed for equal representation of people on public boards. So the idea was to have 50% men and 50% women, but that legislation included trans women, which led to a situation where you could have a board that was entirely made up of biological men, but still fit the quota of equal representation. A Scottish campaign group of gender-critical feminists took the Scottish Government to court over the issue, and that for a few years now has been batted back and forward between the lower courts until finally today we had the ruling from the Supreme Court, and they have found that women means biological sex rather than gender identity. And that might seem quite dry. The ruling interacts with two other pieces of legislation that have become very important in Scottish public life over the past few years. And it has wide-reaching implications for schools, for prisons, for single-sex spaces, and has been a really hot topic in Scotland over the past few years.
Kat, the government have now said it will start to look at single-sex spaces. As you said, this has wide implications. Tell us how this ruling will now be implemented.
This is a huge question, and it is one that the Scottish Government still has to answer. The Parliament is on recess this week, so it will be next week before we have any formal statement from the Scottish Government's ministers. The human rights body that covers the United Kingdom is calling for UK-wide legislation to be looked at again in light of this ruling, and it could have far-reaching implications. The Scottish Government has said today that it will make sure that trans people are still protected and that this shouldn't be seen as a victory for either side. They will very much try to focus on a balancing of rights and make sure that everybody involved is satisfied at the end of any redrafting of laws, which is a big ask because, as I say, this has been a hugely, hugely contentious issue in Scotland for the past few years.
Journalist Kat Stewart, great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. Let's get into this further with British Olympian swimmer Sharron Davies. Sharron, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Great to have you on. First of all, what do you make of the court's ruling today and how significant is this?
It's very significant, obviously. It's clarifying the Equality Act, which was written in 2010. And what's happened for the last few years is that Equality Act has been misrepresented by so many organisations. And obviously my area of expertise is sport. I've been to 13 Olympic Games and won medals at most major championships. And so what we saw there was that a lot of males were identifying and going into women's sport and were winning races that really they shouldn't have been in. And so the fact that biology exists and it matters, particularly in something like sport, was really important. And it was extremely difficult for us to push back against organisations like Stonewall that were misrepresenting this Equality Act. So today, the judges have not changed it. They've not altered it. They've just clarified what it actually meant. And we've been trying for quite a while to get the word biological put in front of the word sex, because when it was written in 2010, everybody knew that sex meant biological sex, but it's been kind of warped. So hopefully now we can get back to a point where we can protect the dignity and privacy of women in changing rooms, in sports, in rape crisis centres, in prisons. These are often vulnerable women that are potentially being put in high-risk positions. I mean, something like football, for example, if you put a male in against a woman is going to get hurt because it's a contact sport. So we need to protect. This is really nothing to do with anti-anybody and just pro-women's rights, which happen to be half of the people that are on this earth.
Sharron, you were talking earlier about your experience as an Olympian. Was the definition of a woman ever discussed when you were competing as an athlete? Or do you see this as a relatively new phenomena that's come up in the last sort of few years?
Yeah, I mean, we had different issues at different times. I was competing during the East Germany era, which is why I speak out, because, for 20 years, these young girls were fed huge quantities of testosterone, which meant that they dominated in the world of sport, but it also made them extremely ill, and many of them have died. And a whole generation lost out in sport during my time. So I didn't want to see that happen again. And we actually had sex screening, which the IOC polled their athletes in 1998, and over 80% of those female athletes said, yes, please carry on with sex screening because we want to protect the female category. And the IOC took it away against 80% of their female athletes. So, women have always worried about this. They've always wanted to protect the female category. This was just another way that their sport has come under attack. And what's so frustrating for us is it doesn't go the other way. Men don't lose their opportunities or their places on their teams or their prize money. I mean, for example, in the last few years, women have lost $1.6 million in prize money in women's events to people that are biologically male. And just recently we had a pool competition, a women's pool competition, and we had 2 men in the final competing against each other. And they won more money between them than the 14 other finalists that were all females. And so we have a tiny slice of the cake when it comes to sport. 4% of the world sponsorship dollar goes to women. And then for the last few years, we've been told we're not even entitled to that. So I just thought, I can't keep quiet about this. This just isn't fair. There must be a space in sport for everybody, but it has to be based on the reality of the biology and the bodies that we have, not on feelings. We can't base laws on feelings. It's impossible.
Inevitably, there will be people who will be against today's decision. Do you think this ruling could continue to be dissected and possibly overturned at some point? Or have we finally reached a place where, as the UK government says, there is now some clarity and confidence for women?
I don't think we're going to see it overturned because I think the vast majority of the general public is pro this decision. I mean, in sport, if we poll, it's always in the 90%. The general public want fair sport. They want their daughters and their granddaughters, their mums, their sisters to have fair sport, to have equal opportunities. So I think we need to talk about this. We need to do it in a very respectful manner. And every group of people needs to be looked after and should be able to identify in a way that makes them feel comfortable. However, I will always go back to the fact that biological reality is reality, and it cannot be trumped by a feeling.
British Olympic swimmer Sharron Davies, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you.
You're welcome.
A reminder of our top stories. Former US President Joe Biden calls out the Trump administration for their handling and dismantling of the country's social security system. China's economy unexpectedly grows, but experts say it's too soon to call as the Trump tariffs kick in. Israel's defense secretary bans humanitarian aid from entering Gaza in order to exert pressure on Hamas. And a landmark ruling finally defines what a woman is, as the UK Supreme Court says it all comes down to biological sex.
When we announced the prison.
And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on X. Counterpoints with Melinda Nusifora is coming up next, followed by the Riz Khan Show. Plus, we'll be back in a couple of hours with a W News Extra. Goodbye.